Today, I'll be presenting to you my book fair. For my book fair, I decided to focus on the Civil War. I'm going to be using the Kansas Department of Education American History Standards for grade 8, which benchmarks 1, 2, and 4, which focus on primary source interpretation, uh, the Civil War as content, and historical thinking. So 2 skills-based standards and 1 content standard. Um, the books that I've chosen for this particular unit are, one moment here, um, divided into 3 sections of my curriculum pie. The first is the sort of broad overview. It's social, cultural, and military issues of the war in context of larger history. So this is your typical curriculum of the Civil War. It's going to deal with groups affected by the war, reasons, the causes of the war, the overview of the war, the different battles, what happened when, who was important, key figures, and things like that. The second section is going to be a sort of classroom adapted intellectual history. Intellectual history is a particular methodology within the history discipline that focuses on the study of ideas. And 2 of my supplemental texts are primarily used for analyzing the intellectual history of the time period. And so I think that that's important for understanding sort of the Civil War in a larger context of Americanism and what that means and ideas of American society. And so that's why I've made that the second portion of my curriculum pie. And then the third portion of the curriculum pie, it's regarding specific elements, one-off events with not necessarily a lot of thematic relevance unless they're analyzed within that context. So you might be able to read this and be like, oh, well, I really understand this one thing, but where does it fit into the larger portion? And so the supplement that I chose for that does not necessarily focus on larger themes. So we'll go ahead and get started. The first book is a textbook. It's History Alive. I checked this out from the LRC. It's their chapter on the Civil War separated into thematic elements. So it doesn't necessarily progress chronologically, but it deals with the Civil War first from a military perspective, talking about the different battles and the progression of the war. And then the second part of the chapter deals with different groups, African Americans, women, soldiers on both sides, and how they're affected by war and what war looked like on the home front, things like that. It is a very dense text. It does not have a lot of graphics, only 2 major graphics in the chapter that I surveyed, and it does do a very good job of summing up the general themes. I would recommend this for intermediate and advanced readers. If you're going to be giving this to beginning and transitional readers, you would need to do some adaptations so that the content is easier for them to access, because in its current state, it's not. It's very, very text dense, and it will require fairly literarily adept readers. For the second portion in the first book in my, in the second portion of the curriculum pie, the first book in that section is a supplementary nonfiction novel by Tony Horowitz. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning war journalist who came back to the United States and traveled around the South surveying sort of Confederate sympathizers living in modern day. This is sort of engaging for students because it does deal with the modern day. It talks about real places and real things that are happening. Some of the themes that he addresses are more mature, like he does talk about racism in the South, so you do need to be aware of who is going to be reading it, and it might be best to pick key passages. The thesis of the book really stands out and is very easily understood. When you look at it, just any given chapter, it basically has to do with Southern rejection of Northern ideals, not necessarily speaking about the South as a whole, but sympathizers of the Confederacy. And I do still recommend it for advanced readers, though, because the difficult language that he employs, as an example, just casually drops the term Rorschach blot in the first chapter, and I was like, probably 8th graders aren't going to be immediately familiar with that. They also need to have context for the content in which they're they'll be reading. So he talks about different battles and places, and they have to know where those are. And if they're not familiar with the Civil War from the get-go or have some sort of cursory knowledge, then it's not going to be very easy for them to understand. And the book, I mean, they probably won't get a lot out of it. So my third book was actually a primary source. It's On Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau. It is ideally taught alongside Martin Luther King Jr.'s Letter from Birmingham Jail, because it talks about themes of civil disobedience in the United States, and so that's why I said that it's really intellectual history. Many people have used this as an 8th grade text. The Common Core has it listed as a high school text, but I think that it's important for 8th graders to begin looking at primary sources early on so that they can develop the skills necessary to decode sort of archaic language and peculiar syntax, and this is a really good text to start with. It's also very important for understanding abolitionism and the lead up to abolition, and also the American cultural context that was taking place at this time. So I think that it's a very, very good essay to sort of deal with that theme. The hypothetical class that I designed this for has a threaded theme, which is a sort of a method thing that we use in social studies to tie classes content together, a threaded theme on American discourse, and so this really fits well into that. So that is my second piece. Again, it's part of the second portion of the curriculum pie because it focuses on the ideas and not necessarily the war even directly, but it does relate to abolitionism as a larger idea of the war, and I thought that that was a really good text for them. Moving into the third section of the curriculum pie, we have Marvel Comics Epic Battles of the Civil War, the first in that series. It's the Battle of Bull Run, which is the first battle of the Civil War. I thought that this was easily the most engaging supplement that I had here because it's very graphic. I'm sorry, not graphic as in violent, but graphic as in there's a lot of graphical representation. It's a comic book. A couple of limitations. If you don't know how to read comic books, if you've never read a comic book before, it can be kind of intimidating, but otherwise I feel like most students would find this to be the most engaging text because it is so visually appealing. It's very, very well put together. You do not have to have a lot of content knowledge going into this because it's written from the perspective of the people participating in Bull Run who had not lived through the Civil War. So it's not important to know about the Civil War necessarily because it's just sort of detailing that particular story. But that's also why it's the third part of the pie. It doesn't necessarily evaluate any key themes unless you're analyzing it specifically for that. But reading by itself, it's just oh, well, this is a battle that happened in the Civil War, and it doesn't necessarily speak a lot more to that. But I do think it is definitely very good for beginner readers because you can go through the comic book, and even if you can't understand the text, you can sort of piece together what's happening. I mean, you can look at this cover, and without even knowing that the Union wore blue and that the Confederates wore gray, you would obviously be able to tell there's some sort of conflict going on, and you would be able to piece together details from that. So I think that that's very handy. We're going to go back up to the third part of the first part of the curriculum pie, I should say, for my website. And for the website, I picked the Civil War Trust's website, and they have a specific student section, and that's the one that I was surveying. It's very, very easy to read. The activities that are on there range from intermediate to sort of juvenile, and it does cover general themes, which is why it's part of the top of the curriculum pie. It is provides a very good overview, and I think that it's really good for students because it allows them some autonomy to explore the different portions of the website on their own. The limitation there being that if they are having difficulty reading, then they'll not necessarily be able to move at the same pace as other students in the class. But there's a lot of graphics. It's very, very well designed visually, so I think that should make it easier on a lot of students. And it's very diverse. And I mean, I've got this screenshot to demonstrate to you, but I'll go ahead and explain. In the center box on the left hand, Lincoln links to a set of resources for students doing research projects. The middle is the general website, and then the third one is interactive activities and games. So we can obviously see that this has a diverse set of resources available to students, and that literacy is going to be less of an obstacle here than it is in the text. And I thought that this was good. It looked a little bit juvenile, but the rest of my unit is very text heavy, and it can be really intimidating to people that aren't necessarily very good readers. And so having this here is definitely a really good step away from that. The sort of very dense choices that I made for the other portions of this fair. So that concludes the survey of my unit. I hope that you have enjoyed it, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my video.